Okay, let's talk about primitive namespaces. We talked in the previous podcast about labeled namespaces, right? Where we explicitly call out something, we make an object or we declare a namespace and we give it a name. We explicitly give it a name. Well, it turns out that in most programming languages, there is the sort of explicit concept of namespaces that are part of the language specification. They're just inherent in the language and you don't have to say it. Okay, so for example, there can be namespaces associated with class names and method names, formal parameters, statement labels, things like this. And these are called primitive namespaces because they're built in, we don't have to say anything. And the truth is, if we wind up doing, kind of a reusing Bob in a bunch of spots, and the compiler can figure it out, then there's no conflict. Okay, here's an example. So this is in the do not try this at home category. All right, so what we have here is a value. The name of the value is int. Okay, this is why this is really a bad idea. Okay, we got a value, we name it int, and we give it the value 3. And the ML interpreter is just like, okay, yeah, happy. Here's an int, but why doesn't it get confused? Why does it not think that you're talking about the type int? And the reason is because it's expecting a name. It's expecting the name of a value here. And so it's operating in that primitive namespace. Okay? Therefore, it doesn't care what you give it because it knows kind of what to expect. Within that namespace, you can call it int, and it's not the same as this int. Okay? So ML is not confused. And I just want to say this because I'm going to say it a couple times. This is not that long of a podcast, but I do want to say this a couple times, hopefully. This is generally a really bad idea. This is meant to help you understand that these namespaces exist, and it kind of is a little bit of a precursor to compiler construction. I'm also going to tell you that nobody in their right mind goes jiggy and starts naming variables after type names like int. It's just really bad because just keep in mind, my philosophy about code is that the first audience for code is other programmers, okay, other developers, including yourself. The second audience for code is the compiler or the interpreter, okay? So I think that's really, really important to just understand. If it's so confusing that you can't understand it or you keep having to remember certain things and you're kind of doing it wrong, even if the compiler or the interpreter accepts it and allows it, okay? So down here, for example, you've got this function f, which takes an integer, and sorry, see, I did it. I did the exact thing. I got a function f, which takes this thing that I call int, and it's defined as int times it. We might have as well said x equals x times x, a equals a times a, but it's not confused. It tells us that f is a function that wants an integer and returns an integer. And if we go f3, we get 9, everybody's happy, but it's just really, really confusing to read. And so, stupid idea. But it's legal and it's possible, and that's the punchline. So anyway, here's a little bit more of an example, right? So ML in the syntax, types and expressions are kept separate. So ML always knows what it's looking for, okay? And so as we talked about, there's a separate namespace for types. So if you look at this one here, these are the dark colored ones, okay, not the purple. Then these ones are in the ordinary namespace, and then these purple ones are in the namespace for types, okay? Something colon, right, that's a type, colon type, it wants that. It wants these guys to be types. So int has to be known to it, or it has to be a type that's been defined. But these first ones, which are just kind of variable names, or just names that we're going to use, they need to be in the ordinary namespace. I hope that makes sense. And then this is really the last slide for this part. But primitive namespaces are not created using the language, okay, like primitive types. These are part of the language definition. Again, it varies based on the language. and some have, separate primitive namespaces. And as an example, in Java, packages, types, methods, variables, statement labels are all separate namespaces. So I can use the same symbol in all those contexts, and Java will not get confused, okay? There's an example in the book on page 159 with the definition of the class reuse, and it's going to only use the word reuse for all of the names of stuff that are defined by the user. In fact, only the words class, for, and if, and return, and break are not the word reuse, and Java's going to be fine. Again, you should never ever write code like that. That is a really, really bad idea. So anyway, that's really it for the primitive namespace. But you do need to understand the concept, right? Even if you would never write code like that, that's not the point. The point is that the compiler or the interpreter looks at the code like that. That's your punchline. In the next podcast, we talk about dynamic scoping, and then we're getting near the end on this particular chapter.